Hi guys, and welcome back to Getting There, the podcast with me, Brogan. Now, today's guest didn't just make a documentary, she made a promise. Olaide grew up in social housing. She knows what it means to live in a high-rise where safety is an afterthought and your postcode defines how much your life is worth. Years later, she lost a friend in the Grenfell fire, a brilliant young artist who had so much life to live. So then her mission became personal. Grenfell Uncovered is her debut feature documentary for Netflix. But don't let the word debut fool you. This is a forensic, fearless, emotionally devastating piece of investigative storytelling. Olaide led the charge, digging through inquiry documentaries, chasing buried emails, and sitting with survivors to protect one thing this country has failed to offer, which is the truth. With a background in factual storytelling and a reputation for integrity and access, she has been named one of the broadcast's hotshots of 2024. But this is not just a product about accolades. As she says herself, Grenfell might have looked like a unique thing, but there's a universality in being the victim of profit over safety. So in today's episode, we go behind the camera and into what she wasn't allowed to show, who tried to silence her, and whether justice will ever come for the 72 lives that were lost in the Grenfell Tower. That was one of the most powerful films I've seen for a very long time. It actually kept me awake for 2 nights in a row. Yeah, no, honestly. And then I was crying one morning and I was like, I said to my boyfriend, I think this Grenfell documentary's really affected me.
Yeah.
And he was like, really? And I think it's because I live so close to the site and I pass it often. And people might think I'm crazy, but you won't, I don't think. You can go past it and feel it.
Yeah.
Like you can feel the energy of what happened there. So take me back. What was the first moment that you realised, I have to make this film?
Yeah, so it was just a transparency. It was being sort of developed already before I came on board. It's something that I've always would have loved to have worked on. People have asked me before, if you could direct something, what would it be about? And there was like a handful of things I'd say, and one of them would be like something like Grenfell, I'd always say. And it's a story that I've always followed as well from when it happened. And I think about 6 months before I got the job, I went to see the play about Grenfell, just because it was something I wanted to do in my spare time. And it was really sort of reminded me of just how harrowing and how horrible the story is, but also how much there's still a lack of justice. And then when I was approached to work on a documentary and it was about Grenfell, I was like, oh my God, that's so weird. But obviously a big part of me was like, absolutely, I want to do this. A small part of me was kind of a bit nervous about whether I should also do this, because I felt like it was a step up for me to direct. I hadn't directed before. And it was directing a very big story of massive national importance for a big broadcaster, a big streamer. So all of that was like making me feel a bit sick. But at the same time, it was just one of those stories that you sort of once in your career, you get to work on something that's just really, really, you know, I wouldn't say it's career defining in terms of, it's not about my career, it's more about like me as a person and those things that will really stay with you. You don't often do them. A lot of people work in TV and do lots of different things, but I think it was kind of like a no-brainer. You get to do something really important and hopefully be part of something that kind of pushes conversations forward. You don't often get to do that. So that was one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to be involved, yeah.
Well, I can't believe that you're 32 and already got that on your CV, like one of the biggest films on Netflix.
Yeah, it's a bit scary.
But aside from that, it's really meaningful and impactful.
100%.
And I think that is the weight of it. And but I want to talk to you. So, like, you grew up in social housing as well, and I wonder what perspective you had behind the lens as a director in making this.
Yeah. So my first sort of, I can't remember now, 11, 12 years, sort of my younger childhood was spent in social housing, and whilst I had a good time, so sometimes, not always, what I was exposed to quite young and quite early on was just kind of how you can sometimes feel like a sort of second-class citizen. I think my parents definitely felt that. You know, we lived in an estate in Bermondsey. It wasn't the best looked after estate. There was a lot of problems. There was crime. There was sort of a neglect, I guess you could say, as well. And I would see my parents spend quite a lot of time on the phones trying to call up about things happening, and nothing would really be done about it. It was various things. And I think the more you pay attention to that, the more you kind of think, oh, do we, like, naive as a child, but you kind of think, do we not matter? You know, that kind of thing. And there was just a lot of problems. And I think when we left, that kind of stays with you, that the kind of things that you saw weren't taken seriously, or the way you felt, or the way we were treated, that kind of stuff is quite defining when you're growing up. So when it came to work on something like Grenfell, and everyone was sort of talking about that very similar experience before the fire, of how they felt treated by authorities, by the council, by the tenement management organisation, it just rang true of, like, that is sometimes how you're treated in social housing. You don't always matter, or you don't always feel like you matter. Whereas actually you just live in a home in London. It's not like, you know, I don't think anyone has social housing written on their forehead, but sometimes you're just treated differently. And I just really resonated with everyone talking about certain experiences that I was like, yep. It feels very familiar. And I think I wanted to make sure that whilst there has been a lot of Grenfell documentaries that have really, really focused on that, so I didn't want to make it the basis of this, but I wanted people to be able to speak their truth, because I understand that truth. It's a similar truth to mine. So that was something that wasn't a driving factor for this, but it was definitely something that I felt we wanted to touch on, because it is very real. It's very real that sometimes when you live in certain housing, people will look at you differently, people treat you differently. And I think a lot of the Grenfell community and the victims of this have felt that. My family definitely felt that when we were growing up. So it's something that we wanted to make sure we touched on in the documentary.
Yeah, because I remember watching it, and one of the gentlemen said he felt like a scrounger, and they were treated like scroungers. And actually, in 2016, the Grenfell Action Group actually almost predicted their own deaths, didn't they?
Yeah.
They wrote a letter saying it's truly terrifying that the thought of only a catastrophic event resulting in serious loss of life will shine a light on the practice that this characterises.
Yeah. Yeah.
Harrowing.
Very harrowing. And I think it just speaks true of the fact that people's voices weren't being listened to, they weren't being heard. And even when they were predicting something bad's going to happen, it's still kind of like, yeah. And I think the response they got to that was that it was scaremongering. And obviously a year later you have the fire. So, well, not even a year later, 6 months before the fire. So I think, yeah, it's heartbreaking to think that. I can only imagine how they all felt, especially Eddie, obviously, who took part. But it's to write that, because you don't actually know. And when I've spoken to him, he's like, I don't want to feel like people think I'm some sort of psychic, but you just worry. But you don't think this is definitely going to happen, but you worry this might happen. And unfortunately, it did happen. And I don't think he predicted it was going to be a cladding fire or anything like that, but I think he just felt like the way things carry on, we're going to be in some trouble here. And that, I don't think that the kind of trouble that they were in, anyone could have predicted. That was, nothing's like that's happened in this country for a very long time.
Mm. And am I right in saying that you had a friend that was in Grenfell?
Yeah, it was someone I knew, who I knew sort of socially through kind of the creative industry. Her name was Khadija. I met her a number of times. We both got into our fields through this company called Creative Access, who kind of help people get into creative industries, whether it's TV, art, marketing, whatever it may be. And I actually didn't know she lived in Grenfell until she was missing. So when I saw her face pop up, I thought, oh gosh, that's Khadija. And it was missing, and I thought, oh, I didn't realise she lived in Grenfell. And then suddenly you start to, do the math. And whenever there's been a massive disaster like that and people are missing,
they're inside.
They're gone. And so I think it was only a few days after I realised that she had passed away, and as did her mum. And so yeah, I think that was part of the reason why it's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason why I always just paid attention to see what was going to happen with Grenfell, when someone was going to be arrested, or when there was going to be some sort of announcement, or when there was going to be something. And there hasn't really been a something yet, I think, unfortunately. But yeah, it's really heartbreaking. We were the same age, and I think she's someone that was doing quite a lot of her life. She was a really good artist. She was breaking down barriers, massive barriers. And her work was taking her to like Venice, was taken all over the world. And I think, it was cut short, and, 71 other lives were cut short. And Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Well, it's interesting as well. When I was watching the documentary, they were saying, you know, they were treated like scroungers, but actually it was a very working class tower. That, you know, you had architects in there, you had artists, you had people that were working.
Absolutely, yeah.
And people who were paying to live there also. And I think that isn't ever really highlighted or spoken about. There were people paying to live there.
Yeah.
I remember the gentleman who was at the top, the Jamaican man.
Yeah.
He'd lived there his whole life, pretty much. It was something they were saying like 36 years or something.
Yeah.
Crazy. And was paying for that.
Of course, yeah. Everyone that lived there was paying to live there in whichever way they were paying to live there. And I think there's always a notion that if you live in social housing, that you're on benefits, that you're a scrounger. And when I first started to meet people in the community, one of the survivors had told us that after the fire, there was like articles calling it Benefits Tower, you know, straight afterwards. And I never saw that myself, but he told us that he'd seen it with his own eyes. I don't know if they've got rid of that now. You can't find it online, but it was being called Benefits Tower. And I think how something like that can happen and how you can see a fire that devastating and that aggressive, that violent, and then your sum up is, Benefits Tower. I can't fathom how your mind gets to that. But it just speaks to how people see people that lived there. And, you know, I didn't even need to meet the Grenfell community to know what kind of people lived there, because at the end of the day, people who live in social housing are not jobless people. You know, everyone's going to work, or they're working for emergency services, they're working at schools, they're working, as we know for Grenfell, there were some of them are artists, architects, IT specialists. There were so many different people who worked there, who lived there, who had all these different career paths, as with most places in London. So it was kind of just that notion that if you live in social housing, that you're some sort of scrounger. It's something that I don't think we're going to eradicate anytime soon. I think it's unfortunately just the prejudice that comes with living in a tower block, particularly. I think when you live in social housing but it's a house, people don't notice. But when you live in social housing and it's a block, particularly a high-rise block, people just associate that with darkness, unfortunately, and they associate that with crime, with unemployment, with benefits. And I'm not sure where that's come from. I'm probably not old enough to know where that originates from, but I definitely felt that when I was growing up, that's how my area was seen, and I definitely think that's how the Grenfell community felt like their estates were seen as well, and still feel that way as well.
And it's almost like you should just be grateful.
Absolutely, yeah.
I felt like that came across quite a lot. And like, you've got a house, like you should just be grateful. But having watched the documentary, you've obviously gone to great lengths in terms of your research and everything. Now, what shocked you the most? Was there a moment when you were like, no fucking way?
Do you know what? A number of things shocked me for different reasons. I think when you look into sort of the refurbishment, and one thing that shocked me that I didn't know before actually was that they were going to demolish the tower. I thought I'd heard about it months before I started the job, but I wasn't sure that was like a real fact that they were going to demolish the tower, because everyone always says, oh, they wanted to get rid of it, that's why this happened. We can't say that's why that happened, but then actually working on it and seeing plans in black and white that they wanted to proceed with demolishment, and talking about how it blights the area, it was kind of very clear that you think this estate and this block ruins North Kensington and you want to get rid of it. That was as clear as day. And then once you then look into the refurb documents and then seeing the costs that were attributed to things, and knowing that, I think the biggest thing is knowing that £5,000 was the difference between safer cladding for that building, and it was still not a cost that was considered, given how much the budget was. It was quite crazy. And I think, don't get me wrong, if they'd used the more expensive cladding, the fire would still have happened, but not to the same extent, I don't think. And maybe it would have burnt slower. People would be able to get out, hopefully. You don't know, but we won't know now because the fire's happened. But I think five grand, I think Pete put it as, approximately £40 a flat, being the difference between flammable and dangerous and then safer cladding, was shocking to me. But I think what also shocked me was just the way people had to escape, those that did escape. And I think I was never too clued up about how everyone exited. I knew people got out. You can only get out through the stairwell. I never once pictured what that looked like. I never knew what that looked like. I never visualized it. I never heard about it. And hearing about it from various voices, young and old, that really shocked me. I didn't know people were kind of stepping on bodies. I didn't know that there were bodies in the stairwell at all. I just didn't think about it, and hearing, like, for Luana, for example, who was like 12 at the time, and hearing her have to describe sort of having to trip over bodies to get out of a burning building is something that a child should never have to go through. And I couldn't imagine that. And I was genuinely shocked when she first told us that. So those are the kind of things that definitely made me stop and be like, what the hell, you know?
Yeah, they were the two probably most things that were flagged to me. I mean, when you break it down, it's probably £10 per life.
Yeah.
Like, that is just like, you can't even buy lunch for that in London.
No.
And I just found it so harrowing. And also, what I struggled to get my head around, I know we have big issues with the cladding.
Yeah.
The London Fire Brigade, because so for anyone listening to this and hasn't watched the documentary yet, they have something called a stay put policy. So when there is a fire, you stay put, and the idea is that you're safe and they'll get to you first. But obviously, with the ferocity of the fire and what the firefighters were reporting was dirty smoke, weren't they? Mm-hmm. Because the plastic essentially was burning and so thick that actually, and I just almost thought, you've got these experienced firemen on the floor that, like they said in the documentary, it was going at such a speed, it was dirty, and yet they still instructed people to stay put. I couldn't understand how the operators on the phone, or no one's seeing it on the television, how there was this huge miscommunication, because there could have been a lot more lives saved.
Yeah. And I think the LFB have owned that there was a massive miscommunication on the night. It was, this project failed. They've owned that themselves. There were a lot of failures on the night. It was an institutional failure. It wasn't necessarily like individual firefighters or anything like that. Even those in the control room, I know they've had a lot of backlash, and I think it's been fair. But I think, I've worked in lots of like emergency services for different documentaries, and the TV's always on. You always know what people are going to. It's just a standard. Sometimes it's the news, sometimes it's like an aerial of something. So it was quite shocking to hear that the TV wasn't on. I think that's something that I probably forgot. And then actually working on this, I was kind of like, why wasn't the TV on? Because the TV's on, and you can see that there's a 24-story building that's wrapped in flames. I don't think you tell anyone to stay put, because the whole point of stay put is that, the fire will stay in the flat it started in for up to 2 hours. So it will be contained, and it won't spread from flat to flat. So clearly that fire has spread from flat to flat. It's gone from the fourth all the way up to the top. So it's quite devastating to know that despite that, people were still being told to stay put, because those who were on the phone didn't have eyes on how bad it was, and those on the ground couldn't communicate with each other because communication was failing on the night. Radios weren't working. I think the overwhelming heat might have had a factor in that as well. So there was a lot went wrong, and I think the stay put policy, I believe, is still in place for high rises. It's a government policy that the LFB follow, but it's a policy that works if the building's not compromised, and unfortunately the building was compromised, and other buildings have been compromised in a similar way, where they've had flammable material on them, and the stay put policy has been in place, but sometimes it doesn't work, and I think Grenfell showed that on that particular night it didn't work.
And what about the operators? Would they even have been allowed autonomy to change that rule, though, if it was a rule? Like, had they have seen this television, could they have said, oh no, you must get out there? Like, are they even allowed to do that?
I'm not sure they are allowed, but I do think that when someone in the control room did see the fire, I think she had gone downstairs and a colleague had showed it to her on a phone or something, the news. Then she put the TV on that was on another floor and was like, gosh, okay. Then went to the floor and told everyone, stay put's revoked. And I think that was, over 2 hours after the fire had started, so possibly a bit too late. I think it was like 2:35 in the morning. And then obviously on the ground, the assistant commissioner at the time had obviously revoked it at around 2:47, I believe. So either way, both times are much later than the fire had started, far too late, and by their own admission. I don't think people have autonomy to go against the grain. I'm not sure how it works with the control rooms, but I know that, when you work in emergency services, you're quite institutionalized. You follow the rules. You go by the book, or you're meant to anyway. So I do think if the book is telling you it's stay put policy, and your boss is telling you it's stay put policy, then you're going to do that. I do think, though, as a human being, if you have eyes on the fire and you're telling people stay put, and you're like, God, okay, that's not what we thought that looked like, you might have, some people might have gone off piste and decided, no, we can't do that. and tell people to get out. Some people might have done. You know, there was a lot of the phone calls were being taken all over the country that night, not just in London. So I'm sure there's some people who probably felt like, I can't tell someone to stay put. Now I see what that looks like, and probably didn't. But at the same time, it was that late that I think people were just in a difficult position, regardless whether they stayed or not.
Do you think the stay put policy should have been revoked now, knowing what we know, or is it too? I suppose it's quite unique to each building. Obviously, there's got to be reasoning behind it. But is this something people have pushed for, to having the stay put revoked?
I think people have pushed for reform in terms of what's on buildings. I think if stay put has proven to work over and over and over, which it may well have done, then a lot of people say there's no evidence to revoke it. But there is evidence to look at what we're putting on buildings. If a building's concrete or stone or, you know, bricks and mortar, and there's stay put policy in place, that fire isn't going to spread the way it did that night on Grenfell and all the other cladding fires that we've seen all over the world. But the difference with Grenfell was it was wrapped in a material that's likened to petrol. So, of course, in that instance, stay put policy shouldn't be in place. And I'm not sure if it's still in place for buildings that have got flammable material on the outside. And if it is, that is quite a scary thought to think about. But I think with revoking the whole policy in this country or, you know, around the UK, I'm not sure, because I think a lot of buildings, maybe it is the right policy, but I think for buildings that are similar to Grenfell, definitely can't be.
And I suppose one of the questions I asked myself was, how on earth was this product allowed to be sold for those purposes?
Yeah.
And what was the loophole that allowed it to be sold as a flammable product?
Yeah, so the thing with that particular material is it's on its own. The material on its own is used for lots of things. It's used for road signage. It's used as a whiteboard. So whiteboards in school, it's exactly the same material. So it's something that is used all over the world for various uses. I think with it being manipulated and altered to be then used as a cladding material, I think is allowed if it's a small building. So I just feel like not enough people were checking the process. I think Grenfell's one of those things where all the layers didn't align very well, and there was failure along the way. And if there's a whole chain of events, and in that chain of events there's been a couple failures here, a couple failures there, a couple failures there, the end product is going to be a failure, regardless, you know. And I think that's kind of what happened. And I think with the cladding getting into this country, it's a material that is allowed to be sold here. You know, that material, like I said, it's whiteboard material. It's very common. It's used for road signages. It's used for lots of different things, awards and little kind of those kind of things. So, but it being used for high-rise buildings is not allowed. And in other countries, it can't be used on high-rise buildings. So I just think the regulation was blurry, maybe. And I think those who were actually working directly with the product and placing it on the building were assuming it was safe. I think there was a lot of assumptions made, I can't say categorically, but I think that's how it happened.
There seemed to be quite a lot of condescending emails like, "Ooh, oops, don't tell anyone."
Yeah, I have to be really careful because obviously there's a criminal investigation going on. But the company that made the cladding were definitely aware from the emails that we've seen that the product was flammable and dangerous. Having said that, it doesn't mean it can't be used, but it means it can't be used in certain ways. And what it definitely couldn't be used for was buildings of the height of Grenfell. Even buildings smaller than Grenfell couldn't be used. So for members of staff to say don't disclose that information to the customer, or be flippantly saying oops, or, you know, we're not clean, all the things that they said that we saw, that speaks to something bigger that I probably couldn't say too much about, but I think people will make their own minds up when they've watched the documentary, if they've watched it, what that is speaking to. But
and when you saw the email, what was your response when it said we're not clean, oops, and it was very flippant, wasn't it, about after? I
think I was shocked. I almost had like a nervous laughter of how you'd even speak that way on an email, and how you could be so bold and open about a product being so dangerous. I just thought that it showed a kind of a lack of care for me. I was quite shocked, yeah.
And post Grenfell, is that cladding still allowed in the UK, or is it now banned?
I'm not sure I've seen anything where it's banned. I don't think it's ever been allowed. So I think it's something that shouldn't have happened, but that material isn't banned. The companies that made the cladding that went on Grenfell still operate. I think they're still making a lot of money, you know. So I don't think there's been a ban per se, but I think there's been a review of flammable cladding on buildings. But I think as things stand, the last time we checked, and it would need to be fact checked again, was it like over 4,500 buildings still had flammable cladding on them across the UK. So I don't know what the process is of getting that removed. I know there was a building last year in Dagenham that was in the process of having their cladding removed, and a fire broke out in the middle of the night. But luckily, that night the LFB decided not to follow a staple policy and evacuated the building. But that fire ripped through that building in rapid speed. So it's worrying to think of a building that was in the process of having it removed and a fire breaking out and all the damage it caused. To think that there's still buildings that have that very similar material still on them, it just takes another fridge malfunctioning, a hair straightener, electric bike. There's loads of things that set on fire every day that the LFB can put out very quickly, but not if there's a flammable cladding put on the building, So it's scary to think about.
Do you think, had the incident been at a private penthouse building in Chelsea, the response would have been different?
Yeah, do you know what? We get asked this a lot.
Oh, do you?
We get asked this a lot about, if it was a building full of posh people, if it wasn't a building in a nice area, would the response have been the same? Based on what people have said, it seems like it wouldn't have been. I think, listening to some of those phone calls, I think the way some people were spoken to wasn't very nice.
Can you give an example?
It wasn't something that we followed in the documentary, but there were phone calls where I just felt, and this is something I actually listened and heard in the play, not in the inquiry, but from some of the phone calls I heard, it did feel like those who didn't have the best command of English, or those who couldn't articulate themselves in the same way, were spoken to in quite a condescending tone. And I don't think those on the end of the phone could understand just what those people were dealing with because they couldn't see it. But they were spoken to in a way that I just thought was quite cold. I'm not saying
I've told you, stay put,
yeah,
stay.
It just felt a bit cold, and I don't think you could. And one of the phone calls I heard, there was this. It was a parent who unfortunately passed away with his family, and he was just pleading to be taken seriously. And I think he was just trying to explain that we need to get out, and this. He was scared. You could hear that he was scared. He's panicked. And I just don't think he was being spoken to with the same
care and respect
that you would expect someone to be spoken to. I can't speak to still whether that's because he had an accent, whether that's because whatever. I can't say that for sure, but I definitely felt uncomfortable listening to the phone call. And I do think that a lot of people have said to us, had it been a building full of rich people, would they have been told to just stay put and let your building burn? Who knows? Probably, who knows? I don't know. I can't say, but I think the response would have been different.
Well, that kind of brings me to another question then. Like, having you heard this, you must have heard so much stuff. There was this stuff that you wanted to put into this that you felt like you couldn't, or maybe if because you said earlier there's a court case, or because that to me sounds really important. And had I heard that, I think it lands with you differently because you think, wait, you're being condescending because someone's got an accent, or you're being frustrated with someone who's just about to lose their life.
Yeah.
Not that it semi feels unforgivable to me.
Yeah, it was difficult, and that's that. We had the first phone call that we did feature, and there were other phone calls. It's complicated when there's a criminal investigation to get phone calls anyway, I did hear some in the play because the play had featured phone calls, and that was something I'd watched 6 months before I started the job. But would it have felt too much? Possibly, because a lot of those phone calls, unfortunately, those people died. So I think it would have been probably quite triggering and traumatic for the families to have those calls played out. One of the families that we spoke to did want us to include a phone call. It was a woman who survived the fire with her 2 children, but her brother and his whole family died. And their phone call, I'd listened to their phone call when I watched the play, and she sent me a recording of their phone call, which was from actors. And those kind of things we did consider, like, would we include it? Where would we include it? But it just felt, it's when those on the end of the phone have died, and you can hear the panic, you can hear children crying. Some of those phone calls are probably just too harrowing to include. And there were a number of, there's one, there was a Facebook Live, for example, of a woman who was recording the whole time. And even then we thought, should we include that? Because there's so much, not content, but like what we call UGC, so user-generated content. So people's own self-made videos or recordings. And that was one that we came across quite early on. And it's one I'd seen before, but I'd never watched fully because I knew she died. And I watched it fully when we were doing the research for this. and you just hear kids in the background crying, and to know those kids then died, and I think they were quite young, I think 2 or 3, you know, so it's stuff like that where there was a consideration to include it, but it's kind of like people will get it, you know, people will get people died, and I don't think you want to overdo it and start to feel like you're trauma farming a little bit. And I just felt like some of the phone calls and material was just that harrowing. Even some of the police helicopter footage and mobile phone footage, there's people you can hear on some of it, people screaming for their lives that you know then die. So that kind of stuff is difficult. It's difficult to have obviously had to watch and listen to, but it would have been very difficult to include in the program, I think, for anyone, because everyone already tells us how hard it is to watch already. So I think including something like that would have been too much.
Yeah, I can understand that. But I must say, from a consumer's point of view, I think you could feel it. Like, so but it's interesting because obviously I don't do your job and there's a reason why, but I would be like, you all need to hear this. Like, you need to wake you the hell up. But you've done it in a really beautiful way where you know what happens, but without being like, I need to turn this off now.
Yes.
I think that's the fine line.
Yeah. And I'm pleased with that, because I think we spoke about it as a team a lot, like where's the line? We don't want people to switch off. And it was kind of like, you know, if you have the fire, do you start with the fire? Do you do this? We thought about different things, and actually, part of the reason why we want people to stay with it was trying to give it enough balance of, we've got to show people the night and what happened, and we've got to talk about it, but we also need to kind of show people things that they can also relate to, like home and the kind of warmth you get from being in your home, what you like about your home. It also reminded people of like 2017 with like the little things like the music and stuff like that, what was going on at the time. I think it was like trying to, you know, have that balance so it didn't feel like you were sat in trauma for an hour and a half.
So how did you know when you were done with the film?
I think we were always over the length of which we had. So we were always trying to think about ways of bringing that down. And I think once we got to a length that was kind of what was agreed, we thought, okay, so it's generally here now. We just need to kind of finesse it. But I feel like before we started filming, I think once we had a shape of what we wanted to do, we always knew where the end point would be. You know what I mean? We have to plan for these things. I think with documentary making, I think people think you just kind of, you know, you get a camera person and you just film until you finish filming. And actually, you have to, it's very expensive. It's a very big process. It's a lot of people that you have to take on. And I think we just plan. So I think when we've planned correctly, and I think with something like Grenfell, you can't just go into it not knowing what you're trying to get, and just, because what happens is you end up engaging a lot of people who then you have to let down. So I think it was about planning properly what we wanted, and what we wanted to achieve, what we wanted to do, and then having that plan. And we went with that plan. You go into the filming process, and you go into edit process, and you're always trying to remember your plan and stick to your plan to some extent. There's also going to be curveballs, which everything has. There's always curveballs, but then once we kind of felt like, okay, everything we've accounted for is sort of here now, we just need to finesse it. That's when it felt like we were almost there. Yeah.
And how were you getting access of all of this stuff? Because I imagine there was a good few bodies like trying to stop you from even getting your paws in to have the phone calls and the emails. Like, oh, you're not allowed to tell me that. No.
I mean, so I can say some stuff. It was, you know, there was a number of us on the team, so it wasn't just myself. There was a lot of us, and we were doing lots of research. Naturally, when it comes to things like phone calls, you know, you have to then talk to like the Met Police because it's an ongoing investigation. The Met Police obviously not going to give us anyone's phone calls because it's evidence for them. And obviously, emergency services don't love when documentaries are being made when there's still an ongoing investigation. But at the same time, there's a story to be told. People want us to tell that story. So that, you know, I wouldn't say they were obstructive or anything like that, but I would say that they didn't want to work with us, you know, and that's fair enough. I think obviously with Grenfell, there's a lot of mistrust in that community, and not just in the community, but those who have been affected by the story as well. There's not a lot of trust for media or journalists, and I understand why. I think whenever there's been a major tragedy or disaster, a lot of dodgy people come out of the woodworks, and I think there's a lot of mistrust. And I think with us, it was a trust building exercise, first and foremost. And I think when you meet people, whether they're lawyers or they're victims or they're members of the community or they're activists or they're journalists, whoever they are, I think it's about building trust. And I think that was hard, but also that was not something we were trying to do overnight. It was a slow process to build trust. But I would say the obstacles did come from people who just maybe didn't want this to happen, or they didn't want to help, or didn't want to support the project. But that happens with lots of projects. You'll be surprised. I think I've worked on lots of things where you think it should be straightforward and people just close doors on you all the time. I think one of the hardest jobs I worked on was a football documentary, because the football world do not like media either. They like to control their media. So it's not just with like Grenfell being a tragedy that it was hard to get access. I think a lot of documentary making access is hard, and you have to have a lot of patience, and you need to just kind of bear with people. But then you also need to know when you're beat, and then you move on. And sometimes the plan B was better than plan A, you know? So sometimes what you thought you didn't need was better than what you thought you needed. So I'd say with Grenfell, everything sort of aligned the way it was meant to in some ways.
Well, the fire was one thing, but
Yeah.
how the victims were treated afterwards seemed to be another thing.
Yeah.
Can you, for anyone that's listening that may have not have watched it, how were the victims treated after?
So a lot of the victims felt like they were treated really poorly after the fire. They felt like they were ignored. They felt like they were forgotten about. A lot of them were, I wouldn't even say they were in temporary housing. Some of them were sleeping in, gyms, community centres, in their
long?
cars. So some people for weeks, some people for months, So I think people were eventually put in hotels. But there was one person we spoke to who only got his permanent house when we were speaking to him last year. He'd been moved around a lot in different temporary housing, and I think he might be the last person to be housed, but he was only housed last year. And that was 7 years on from the fire. So that speaks to just how some people were treated. And I think they just felt like a burden on the council, and I think that they felt like a burden on the country. And actually, it saddens me to hear people speak that way, because that's the last thing they should feel after going through what they've just gone through. Some of them who have lost loved ones, some of them have lost friends, some of them who have survived by the inch of their lives. So I think to go through all of that and then to be thinking and feeling like you don't matter, it's devastating.
Do you feel like they were failed again for a second
100%.
time?
I think everyone can see that they were failed again. I think everyone can see that, and the authorities can own that they made mistakes. The authorities feel like, if this was happen again, they probably will respond to it differently. There wasn't a proper plan in place. I think there was a lot of loopholes. I think a lot of people who didn't even live there were able to sort of get aid for that. I know that happened a lot after the fire, and I think it was just very unorganized. I think it was very unorganized, and I think watching some videos of people kind of squeezed into one hotel room, and it's like a family of 5 or family of 6. It's kind of, this can't be the way you want people to be feeling after a major incident like that. So
No, it was interesting because I remember reading something in the newspaper as well, but it's interesting, the media's narrative, isn't it? Like, oh, more scroungers claiming to have been in Grenfell get more money.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it seems like the real victims got lost in the chaos somehow.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also it's just, I think no one knew who was meant to be dealing with it. I think a lot of the victims were kind of like, who are we meant to talk to? Who's meant to be our point of contact? Who's our key worker? Or who's our, who's going to help us? And I think it's weird, I think, sometimes as a country, the way people respond to these incidents, because, obviously there's always going to be, like I said, you get major incidents and people who are a bit dodgy come out of the woodworks. That always happens. But what I think is weird is when everyone places hyper focus on that and ignores the bigger thing that, okay, that to one side, those couple of individuals to one side, there are a number of people who have just lost their homes and they've lost their loved ones. And there's a lack of empathy sometimes, I think, in this country if people don't identify with the victims. I think I often wonder what the victims need to look like and sound like for people to care. And I think that was seen a lot in the aftermath, that if you don't look at them and see yourself in some way, then you sort of you change the channel, or you switch on. And I think that's how a lot of people felt. I think they felt like, because of who they were, where they came from, there wasn't an urgency to help them from authorities, but there also wasn't enough empathy from the rest of the country to sympathise with them and empathise with their situation. Hence why you got articles like, so-called articles like Benefits Tower and stuff like that, and loads of commentary online about them being scroungers or people subletting or people who was really living there. Regardless of that, does that mean people should have died? Do you know what I mean? So I didn't really understand, and I still don't understand the way sometimes the country responds to some of these incidents. And a victim doesn't need to look like me for me to care. And I wish more people felt that way. That's something that I definitely felt whilst whilst making this, that it wasn't the primary focus of what we were doing, but I think the way the survivors were treated, people can come to their own conclusions as to why they think that was. Yeah,
I think people forget we're all human.
That's what angers me sometimes. It's kind of like, these are human beings. You don't have to look like them or sound like them or know who they were to care. We all see things all the time. We can watch even scripted projects and cry our eyes out. Like One Day, I cried, I don't know them, then they're fictional characters, but you can watch something like that and you can cry. Marley and Me, you can cry. There's so many things that you could watch where you don't know the people, it's just like a soft drama, and you can cry. But I feel like it's weird when then real people have been affected by something and you start looking for reasons why you don't care. I just think it's a really weird response, and I feel like they're just human beings. And I just think what people forget sometimes with Grenfell is that could have been anybody. And it's not just a case of, oh, this was a targeted social housing building. This was a building that was wrapped in cladding. A lot of nice buildings are also wrapped in cladding, and inflammable cladding, should I say. And would you think differently if it happens to people that you identify more with? I don't know. But I feel like there's often a lack of empathy and sympathy for victims of disasters if people don't identify with those victims. And I just felt that I felt, and I think a lot of the Grenfell community felt that was what's happened to them.
What does justice for the victims look like to you?
I think justice is quite nuanced for the victims. I think some people obviously want people to go to prison, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. There's an ongoing criminal investigation. I don't think charges, should there be any charges, they won't be announced till late next year, we've been told. That might change. But I know a number of people want someone to go to prison. They want people to go to prison. They want to see heavy sentences. We don't know if that's going to happen, and we're years from that. And I think other people who maybe don't feel like that's going to bring their loved ones back just want change. And they want the government to be saying, we're going to remove all the flammable cladding off of these buildings. And, the cost is going to be covered by X, Y, or Z. At the moment, it's all quite a grey area of what's happening, when it's happening, who's paying for it. It's all quite grey. And I think people want that grey area to become more clear. And until they've seen real change and real action being taken off the back of Grenfell, I think that's, for a lot of people, justice is being delayed. To answer the question, I think justice looks different to different people. I think some of the younger people want change and accountability. Not say they don't care about criminal sentences, but I think they're not identifying that as much. Whereas others want people to go to prison. As simple as that. It's black and white as that. But I think either way, people want clarity as to what is actually going to happen. And I think that is still quite grey.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't know as much as you, but obviously it seems quite difficult as well with the product was manufactured abroad and jurisdiction stuff, and it's all, again, just a very messy situation.
Yeah.
And I know this is a bit of a weighted question, but obviously you've done so much research, you've spoke to everyone. What do you think's to blame? Like, is there someone that you think should go to prison more than anyone else?
No, there's not one individual I could say. I couldn't personally say who should go to prison, but I think having worked on this and having done the research, as a number of us on the team have done, is we all have our opinions, but I think it's clear that wrongdoing took place by a number of individuals, by a number of organisations. Some of that wrongdoing is as black and white as an email. And I do think with what we know is out there, and the information is there for people to go and read in the inquiry or see what they can see in the documentary as well, that there's a lot of evidence of wrongdoing from a number of parties. And so I couldn't say that it's like one person should go to prison. I do say to people when people ask me this, I don't think Grenfell is one person's fault. I think Grenfell is a carousel of failure and errors and wrongdoing by a number of people, a number of organisations. And I think that's what makes it harder to then pin it down, to then do something about it. Because I think, I don't know, God knows how many people the police are talking to and interviewing. I think when there's an incident or a tragedy that involves that many people, it's very hard to then say, that's the guy, arrest him, he should go to prison. I don't think it's as clear-cut as that with Grenfell.
And on a personal note, once you'd made the document, so when did it go live on Netflix?
On the 20th of June.
So, I mean, for anyone for relevance, it's July, what is it?
July 8th? It's now July 8th,
July 8th.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's in its height at the moment.
Yeah.
I've got to know, the day it went out, were you expecting it to be received the way it was? Was there Like, what was going on in your head?
Do you know what? Do you know what we had in the lead up to it going out? We had bereaved and survivor screenings. We had community screenings, and we also had a premiere at Sheffield Doc Fest. So the bereaved and survivor screenings were, and the community screenings were really difficult. It's a really hard day. It's very raw. It was very emotional, really, really emotional. And I think that clouded my head for the rest of that week, to be honest. People wailing and crying and running out of the room, and it was just
I can
really,
imagine. I don't think I could sit there if
Yeah.
I was you either.
Yeah,
because
it was
you know
really
these people.
Exactly. And I chose to sit there because I feel like I wanted to be seen. I wanted people to know I'm there.
Well,
I wanted people to, if they need to turn to me, ask me a quick question, they could do that. You know, sorry, I don't want to make you upset. No.
Honestly, I don't think it's until you watch it you can understand.
And I think it was, it was difficult. It was really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think, but I'm glad I sat through, and I'm glad we were able to do it, and give people the opportunity to see it before it went out, because there's a lot of raw emotion still in that community, and I think people of all ages that were crying, that just needed a hand to hold, and I think it's interesting just how many strangers I've hugged. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But actually, it's a good thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. I think there's a shared vulnerability with Grenfell. I've said to a lot of people, and I think, you feel that when you're in the community. So I think that day was such an emotional day that the rest of the week was a little bit cloudy for me. And I think I was really nervous about it going out and and I sort of knew how it was received on a micro level, which was probably the most important level.
Yeah.
I think I in terms of the smaller screenings, the smaller groups, but obviously knowing that this is a massive community. And I think it being received the way it was by them, which was generally quite positive. Naturally, not everyone's going to be happy, but it was generally quite positive. And there's a lot of thank yous for making this. And I think when people say thank you for making this, it's quite hard thing to take as you don't want to be like, oh yeah, you're welcome. That's not how you respond. It was just, that's actually makes me emotional when people say thank you, actually. But then it reminds you just how much this is affecting people. And when I had the Sheffield premiere, that room was received it very well, like really well, more than I could have imagined. There was a standing ovation for the victims and for the film, and that was
and for you.
that was a real shock. It was a real shock to see, and I think all of that was, so the emotion of that week was so big that I was just quite anxious for it to actually go out on the platform, and then suddenly it's there. And then the day it did, I felt like I was hiding from everyone. I felt like it was one of those ones where I was suddenly getting loads of messages that morning and getting tagged in things on Instagram, and I was just like, oh my god. And I think everyone who works in TV always feels anxious when anything they've worked on goes out. But I think something as serious, as important as Grenfell, it's kind of now, you feel really exposed because there's going to be so many opinions. A lot of people are going to, people always have opinions when a documentary about a disaster or a tragedy is being made anyway. And then it's the kind of nervous wait for what those opinions are going to be. And what was quite heartwarming is a lot of those opinions were really, really moving. I think, the articles, the reviews, that like my brother kept sending me all these TikToks. I was like, I can't believe I worked somewhere where people were doing TikToks about it. And actually, it was nice to see. And I think all of us felt quite proud to have played a part in bringing this to life. And I think, but I definitely was bricking it, basically. in the lead up, I definitely was, yeah.
Are you still finding pinch me moments?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it's just really, it's weird to think about, I think. I think it's even weird to get sent all these articles or sent things and see my name because obviously it was a big team of us, but I think it's weird seeing your name sort of written down, attached to something, and people are speaking about it nicely because it's a very hard, not a hard compliment to take, but I think I don't know if it's an imposter syndrome or it's a nervousness or it's an anxiety or it's kind of a surreal feeling when you work on things that everyone's talking about. And, when it came out, I felt like everyone was talking about it. And I think it was really weird. My brother was telling me that he was on a train on the way to work and a woman next to him was watching it on her phone. And he really wanted to say to her, oh, that was my sister. But he said he thought it'd be weird. But even then, him telling me that was weird because I was thinking, oh, that's so interesting. And it was just kind of like, it felt like a lot of my friends and family, some of them, and some friends I hadn't spoken to for a long time were like, oh my God, I just seen your name in the credits for this thing I just watched. And all of that was quite, it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming to take. Yeah, but it was in a good way, but definitely, yeah.
And where does that lead you next with your career? Because it seems like you've got a knack for being able to because obviously even what we spoke about, you having that fine line between the dance between making people want to show it off and also the weight of the situation. Has that made you feel like, as a director, this could kind of be your avenue, or what's it made you think you want to do next?
Do you know what? Obviously, it'd be nice to do something slightly lighter next. I've done a lot of things in my career. I've done heavy stuff. I've done lighter stuff. I've done a mixture. I'd like to continue doing a mixture. I think, as I said, it's really good to when you get to do things that have massive national importance. You don't get to do those very often either. So when they come along, you're like, why not? But there's also a weight of responsibility that comes with doing these kind of projects. And that's a heavy weight to bear at times. It definitely was when making this. There were times where, you know, I was really reminded of just how heavy it was. And I don't want to feel like that all the time. So I wouldn't say I would be back to back working on things
like this,
like that have such massive trauma attached. I'd love to work on things that are a bit lighter, but at the same time, there is a privilege to working on things of national importance. You feel like you're part of generating conversation. You feel like you're part of what someone might show someone to say, to explain something. You know,
you're part of change.
You're part of change, and I think it's a rarity to be part of change. So if there's opportunities that come a lot my way to be part of that, I'd obviously consider them. But where I'm going next, I have no idea. I've only recently finished, but it's but I'm quite open-minded as to where I go next. Yeah.
It's interesting because when we started this off, I know you were like, oh, it's weird. And then, like, you know, I knew somebody in Grenfell and I was following it and I was attached to it. And then, you know, it landed on your door. But for me, that was like divine timing. That was meant for you, this project. But why is it you think that they picked you?
Do you know what? I don't know.
Because because it is. I was like, when you said you were 32, I mean, it's a huge thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of people were shocked. Don't get me wrong.
Were you shocked?
I was definitely shocked. I remember when I got the phone call. I was in a walk in the park at the time, parking in my house, and my exec called me and he told me I got the job, and I was genuinely I was really surprised, and I had like a mild panic attack after that phone call because I was just kind of like, oh my God, because then suddenly it's like, oh gosh, this is actually going to happen now. And, you know, it's a step up. I know I directed before, and it was, you know, a big story. It's a big platform. And I did obviously question why me. I spoke to lots of people who were like, why are you questioning it? Just do it. Like, you know, a man wouldn't have this dilemma. Just what, and a lot of people told me that.
So interesting. Yeah, I thought that.
Yeah. And maybe that's so maybe it's a woman thing, but just go for it. Like, why are you questioning why, you know, just do it. And obviously I did it, but I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome going into it. Absolutely. I think that's common in the creative industries anyway, in life, to have imposter syndrome. And I think I definitely questioned a lot why I was picked. But I'm very grateful that I was. You know, obviously Netflix and Brogan saw something in me that I probably don't see in myself. So I appreciate the opportunity. But I feel like, you know, I care. I really care. And I'm hoping maybe part of that care is what came across, you know, when I was being interviewed and when I was writing up, you know, a vision statement and those kind of things, that was received. And that was part of the reason, because, and I think that care, I just kept trying to pour into the project, you know, all the way through, and encourage others to as well, because I think sometimes, you know, it makes things better. It makes you sort of remind yourself why you're doing it, and it makes you know, it'll come across on screen when you're giving care to something, I think.
I suppose this leads me to my last question then. So for anyone that's listening to and resonating with your story, maybe it's in their own personal work or whatever, anyone that's feeling that little bit of imposter syndrome, what would you say to them?
Good question, because I still feel like I haven't quite conquered it. But I would say a lot of things that help me is trying my hardest not to care what people think, because I think that adds to imposter syndrome. And I do care what people think, but I can't let it define where I'm going. So I feel like that's one thing. I can't obsess over impressing people. And I think with me, particularly with something like this, with directing for the first time and directing for a big broadcast, a big streamer, and a big story, it's actually not obsessing over impressing my peers. It was about doing what I thought I needed to do. And if that is the right thing, then a byproduct of that will be they're impressed and they're happy. So I think sometimes when people have anxiety and imposter syndrome, which I have all the time, to be honest with you, a lot of that comes from someone's over planning, over worrying, overthinking, which we all can identify with. So I think sometimes it's checking with yourself, what is it that's bothering you? If it's like, oh, they are going to think this and they're going to think that, then actually you have to kind of draw a line at what people think first and foremost, and that sometimes will then dull that noise a little bit, and which is what I tried to do with this. So I'll say that's one thing. And also you have to own what you don't know. I think sometimes when we go into things for the first time, we want to be able to be perfect at everything. You know, we want to be able to do it all brilliantly straight away. And sometimes it's okay to fail. You know, it's okay to trip up. It's okay to get things wrong, because actually getting things wrong, you taught you something, and you can do it right the next time or the time after that. So I think being comfortable with failure, not caring what people think, and owning what you don't know, I think are all ways that kind of help deal with imposter syndrome or starting something new for the first time.
That is a great bit of advice, and I think sometimes you've got to go for it, haven't you?
We
let the mind take over too much. But I know you are an extremely busy lady. It took us a little while to nail you down. So thank you so much for coming here today. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Yeah, no, appreciate you having me.